Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We have an excellent panel and some presentations we're going to take you today. And the topic for today's webinar is the operator strategies in cloud native networking. So first of all, just run through the agenda and take you through a couple of logistical things. We can have the next slide, please. Today, we've got myself, I'm the consulting director. I will be facilitating the session today. And I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Matt Bamforth, who's going to share some of the findings from our recent research into how operators are tackling cloud native networking. We are also joined by Todd from Oracle, who's going to share some of Oracle's experience of implementing cloud native with operators. We're joined by Darwin from Sasktel, who's a senior planner in technology strategy, and by Shakil Ahmed from Telenor. I'm very grateful for them to join us and share their experiences as they grapple with the cloud native technology and look to implement it within their networks. So that's who we've got lined up today. In terms of the agenda, what we've got is what I'm doing now, housekeeping, just take you through how to use this GoToWebinar for those of you not familiar with it. And then we've got a presentation from Matt, which is going to share the research findings from our conversations with operators on this subject. And then Todd's going to take us through what is the role for reducing risk and fear, and the challenge and the experience, Oracle's perspective of helping operators make that transition. We got a panel discussion and we got Q&A, and then we've got a little bit of wrap up at the end of that. So that's what we've got installed for you today. Just take you through a couple of things now before we kick off. First up, everyone who's joining, the participants, you're on listen-only mode. You will stay in listen-only mode. If you need to get to us or comment, if you're having any difficulties, do use the comments control bar. Also, we will have some time at the end of the session for questions, so please do feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A. We'll do our endeavour to get through them. If we're not able to cover your question, we will try and respond to the questions and get back to you after the event and share those responses with all of you. We're going to send you all the slides, so don't worry about having to take screenshots. We will share all the slides and also the recording so you can share with colleagues. So you're on Twitter, please do feel free to tweet, to share with us, and enjoy the webinar. So that leaves me to introduce Matt Bamforth and ask Matt to take us through the findings from our recent research into what operators really think and what really matters with cloud native. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. So cloud native is a topic that has really come to the fore over the last 12 to 18 months. And at STL Partners, we are constantly being asked where operators are at with cloud native and what their plans are moving forward. No doubt this has been exacerbated by the move to 5G standalone and now increased talk of Open RAN as well. But as you say, Phil, the questions that we are really seeking to answer in this research and that we'll cover today are, why does cloud native matter, and what do operators really think about it? So I think when we think about cloud native, the context really matters. And at STL, we believe that we are moving into the coordination age, which is the third age of telecoms. But what came first was the communication age. So this was about connecting people, allowing them to communicate immediately, first through telegraph and then telephony. The information age was what came next. And this came with the emergence of the internet. So when people could suddenly access information and entertainment immediately. In the coordination age, which, as I say, is this third age of telecoms, things are increasingly connected through IoT and cloud-based applications. But this is going to drive an increase in data volumes. Hence, there is a growing need for resource efficiency. But all of this is set against the backdrop of stagnating telco revenues, and tech companies are constantly innovating and have overtaken the telcos in recent years. So in 2019, we found that 7 internet players had generated around 65% of the revenue that was generated by 165 operators globally. But at the same time, they still had a roughly 50% larger market capitalization. So it's clear that operators need to provide new and differentiated network services that can work hand in glove with both the telco's own and other people's applications. So operators need to achieve greater innovation and at scale. So fast, low cost, reliable, highly automated. In other words, cloud native. So both 5G and Open RAN are intended to be cloud native from inception, and we see this at STL as a genuine opportunity for operators to innovate and create some value. As Phil mentioned, we spoke to a number of operators for this research program, and they were in broad agreement about the definition of cloud native at least. So we take the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's definition, and they define cloud native as empowering organizations to build and run scalable applications in modern dynamic environments. So this approach is typified by containers, microservice architecture, service meshes, APIs, and then combined with automation, this allows for continuous integration and deployment, or CI/CD, and a move to a more DevOps-orientated approach. So then these more loosely coupled systems, in theory, open the way to a best-of-breed approach. And when we interviewed this range of operators, and there was a range of sizes and geographies that we spoke to, and they were in broad agreement, at least, about the definition and implications of a cloud-native approach to networking. But where there was more disagreement was how this was going to work in practice. And we found that the operators broadly fell into two different camps. So at one end of the spectrum was those operators that were more ambitious. And then at the other end were those who were slightly more cautious. So looking at the ambitious operators first, they really saw cloud native as more of an engineering task. So typically they are bigger, although there are some that are a bit smaller, but they have deeper pockets with which they can invest in skills and therefore able to take more of a hands-on approach to their own networks. As a result, they need an understanding of the internal workings of the underlying components. So then, due to the range and complexity of the network, a CI/CD pipeline needs to be managed. These operators see themselves as becoming more like software-based technology firms, and they're definitely looking to adopt this best-of-breed model. In this sense, their approach is more akin to how cloud-native applications are managed in enterprise IT domains. Then the second group are the more cautious operators, and they're looking to assemble cloud-native networks. They see themselves as operators of other people's technology. They're doubtful of their own ability to construct the networks like the bigger, more ambitious operators do. And likely this is because they have a workforce that is more limited, either in size or in terms of skills. As a result, they don't need the same detailed understanding of the underlying components, and they're more open to the benefits of working just with a single vendor. And in this sense, this approach is more akin to how legacy networks have traditionally been deployed and managed. But what we want to do next is actually hear from the audience, and we want to hear where you see your operator or perhaps an operator that you are closely related to as standing. And hopefully in a moment you should get a pop-up box which shows you both the question and the options that you can select from. But the question is, are cloud native practices, so DevOps, CI/CD, best of breed, are these a core part of your network transformation? And I think it's important to emphasize that we're talking about cloud native practices here, not just the implementation of cloud native code. And then the four responses that we have are, yes, this is already a core part of our transformation. Not yet, but within the short term, which we define as the next 2 years. Not yet, but beyond the short term. So, again, the 2-year period, but this is saying, while you don't see cloud native practices as coming in now, you definitely do see them as in the future a core part of your network transformation. And then the fourth option is no, this will never be a core part of our transformation. So you simply don't believe that cloud native practices will ever be applicable to your network. And we'll just give you a few seconds to respond, and then once we have enough responses, we can take a look at the results. Okay, give a few more moments. Okay. So I think the poll is closed now, and hopefully we should see the results. There we go. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I think the thing that jumps out immediately is obviously that we have just under 50% of people believing that cloud native practices are already a core part of their network transformation. This seems like, I mean, it's obviously good to see this figure, but it seems like quite a big figure, especially off the back of the conversations that we were having in our research program. But I think, you know, if we look then at the other end of the scale, it's similarly interesting that we have such a small number of people who believe that it will never be a core part of their transformation. So 98% of the respondents believe that, but either now or in the future, cloud native practices will be a core part of their transformation. Okay, great. So what we're going to do next is look at some of the recommendations that we made in the report for the different types of operators. We did this by devising a 2x2 matrix. And the theory is that every operator should be able to fit into one of the 4 quadrants that we defined. So the x-axis is what we've already addressed. So the operator's level of ambition for change. So whether they have this cautious or more ambitious approach to cloud native. And then on the y-axis is market environment. So this is the operator's perceived pressure on their own existing model. The first group that we'll look at is the cautious operators who perceive themselves to be under limited market pressure. And we say to them, guard against complacency. So these are more likely to be incumbents or established challengers in markets with less historic competition. You need to challenge your own assumptions and then plan for the changes to come. So this means beginning to build towards a more software-first organization and choose partners with deep IT and cloud experience who can further your own learning. The next group that we'll look at are the ambitious operators who, you know, still perceive themselves to be under limited market pressure, and we tell them to align for action. So these operators will likely be in a market with more managed competition, but perhaps with a history of developing their own technology and innovating. You need to understand where to build your own IP and then focus on this, channel your company's resources and energy where it matters most. But you need to commit properly to this transformation. So reorganize, reskill, recruit, and then reward employees. But you also need to choose partners who are experienced in implementing cloud native. And this is to mitigate the risks and challenges of moving to this approach. Then the third group are the cautious operators who are under considerable market pressure. And we think that urgent reevaluation is needed in this group. So they're likely to be established operators in larger, more advanced markets, but perhaps restricted. So this might be by regulation, legacy services, investors, or even an instinct to try and maintain reliable credentials. But do not defer decisions, act decisively and with clarity. And it's really important to avoid a kind of business as usual inertia, but then make sure that this clarity is actually communicated to your stakeholders. So select partners that can inspire confidence and then drive this change, those who can demonstrate a track record of success with cloud technologies. And then the final group that we look at are the ambitious operators who are under considerable market pressure. They need to stay focused and on track. Typically, these will be operators in larger, more advanced markets with a really strong technology skills base and success in building digital business revenues. But they still perceive their model to be under significant pressure and may even consider their connectivity business as unviable in its current form. But don't pursue cloud native as an end in itself. Ensure that networking transformation is coupled with the development of new services, and make sure that clarity of purpose on the overall vision is shared by all and communicate to stakeholders if not. Choose ecosystem partners who share your commitment to realizing an open, cloud native and standards approach. And I think if we go to the next slide, then we'll be hearing from Oracle next.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you very much for that, Matt. And I should mention that Matt just shared the highlights from the report that we've published, and we will be sharing the link for where you can download that report and get all the details and some of the more detailed commentary and feedback from the interviews we had. So do look out for that link down the report. Next up, I'd like to invite Todd to share with us briefly, you know, how Oracle is seeing cloud native being adopted by operators for automating and reducing risk and fear in networking. So over to you, Todd.
Thank you. So just a little bit about me. In addition to you're probably wondering why Oracle's here. Aren't they the guys that do the database and the ERP and customer experience? But in addition to those horizontal technologies, Oracle has about a dozen different industrial global business units, and I actually work in the communications business unit focused on our portfolio strategy, and as you'll see here, sort of evangelizing how cloud technology can help this space. So if you can go to the next slide. So whether as a CSP you fall into this ambitious or cautious camp that Matt was explaining really depends upon your appetite for risk. And so as Oracle sees it, cloud native technologies, especially with automation, specifically continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous testing based automation is fundamental for mitigating the risk in order to deploy an agile network. It potentially reduces the risk for those that are cautious in adapting that newer technology. And similarly, it reduces the risk for those who are more ambitious from not being responsive enough to, frankly, some pretty aggressive competition in the communication space. So going from waterfall, where in theory, everything was supposed to be planned a priori and thoroughly in order to help de-risk, we're now moving to these agile loops. And the risk is managed there by understanding the dependencies a lot better, which then can be thoroughly tested. And those smaller increments that you see in an agile loop instead of a very large amount of content actually decreases the surface area for where there can be issues and really enables that sort of drip of innovation instead of this big bang that can really come with a high risk. And what we've seen is that really improves overall reliability. And not only is the automation that you're seeing with CI/CD, CT enabling this, but fundamentally the cloud native infrastructure is also enabling this. So as Phil was saying, we've sort of had quite a bit of observations working with quite a few carriers across the globe. And our own informal data has seen that such automation is about 90% more reliable with test results than classical waterfall. And that is absolutely significant. And a lot of that really comes from this automation that's derived, again, on fully understanding the dependencies of the smaller increments. But we're also seeing that we're getting, people are able to deliver 80% faster and 60% cheaper. And I think those are important metrics as well. It has enabled us to go from releasing every 6 months in a 4G environment to every 2 months with our new cloud native 5G network functions. Furthermore, we can complete a full test suite of over 800 test cases in less than 10 hours. This is something that in the past would take 2 months in itself within the waterfall process, which was heavily manual. In fact, we now have customers who are using our automation and testing on a nightly basis. This tests everything from our NF to as well as the underlying foundation and how it interacts and integrates into the other network functions that are sometimes not even ours. And this nightly testing really takes a commitment from our part, because in the past, if you think, really it was during a soak period or maybe unfortunately during a live situation that you would learn where something isn't working. With such vast automation running on a nightly basis, trust me, we hear our customers, first thing in the morning when they wake up and if the status is not green. So it really takes a large commitment from not only the operator, but also from the vendors to be able to stand behind this level of automation. So we can go to the next slide. So at this point, you may be asking, didn't we get a virtualization architecture and automation with NFV, and how is this cloud native really different? So beyond going into the technical details around how lifecycle dependencies between soft layers were causing all these really horrific and unnecessary complications and orchestrating DNFs, the CNCF-based platform ecosystem, which most cloud-native implementations have been based on, are considerably much more open and accepted across more than just the telecom space. This is extremely important. This has enabled much more of the enterprise and hyperscaler cloud experience to be incorporated into now what's being delivered as 5G cloud native networks. We did not see this really occurring in the NFV days. Yes, we were using things like OpenStack and stuff like that. However, the orchestration mechanisms and the way that automation was handled was completely divergent from what was occurring in that era within the cloud, the other enterprise cloud space. Whereas today, we really see a large alignment. We find it's a lot easier to move our network functions from one cloud native or one CNCF-based cloud native platform, whether that be a popular commercial variant like Tanzu or OpenShift, or even the self-assembled ones. We are seeing operators who are really at the cutting edge, assembling from open source their own cloud native paths. And as long as they're adhering to that, we're finding that our network functions can easily move into those environments. Likewise, we found that similarly, it's easy to integrate into most of their pipelines. So as long as the CSP has a Jenkins-based, CI/CD/CT pipeline, and this is even taking into account operators who are going quite complex with multiple pipelines, with multiple stages, and of course, extremely comprehensive testing frameworks. And so even with those kinds of conditions, we're finding that it's fairly easy to take our methodology around how we work with a pipeline and shift from one operator's view to another's, as long as they're sort of sticking to the basics of how this works from a CNCF perspective. I believe now that with cloud native, we're about to finally leave this trough of disillusionment with interoperability around virtualized networks. And for us, interoperability has always been fundamental. It's just been the core thing that we bring to the communications market. If you think back, STP, DRA, a signaling router must be, seamlessly able to talk to every node within the network. Likewise, policy, which has been fundamental for operators to differentiate themselves, it just does not work unless you have that interoperability between the policy subsystems and the rest of the network. And then there's the SBC, which is fundamental to even making SIP work in the early days. A testament to practically forcing interoperability norms when many didn't even exist. However, with NFV, many gave up on best-in-class interoperability because with the platforms and the orchestration and the virtualization layers, it was just too difficult. But we're really seeing cloud native come in and starting to change this dynamic. And it's bringing back the ability for CSPs to actually embrace best of breed. And we think that's important. And that really cloud native with automation is a huge tool for that. By no means do I want to trivialize what it still takes to succeed in achieving a best-in-class 5G core, but we've seen that those CSPs who embrace partnering with their supplier ecosystems, using a true CNCF-based cloud-native platform, and utilizing a CI/CD/CT delivery, it's actually possible to achieve an agile core. You can go to the next slide. So again, not everyone may completely understand where we come from and how we're approaching the market. For 5G, Oracle really is concerned about what we call the decomposed control plane. And we see a couple pieces to that. First and foremost is the signaling and routing. And so in that space, you see we have capabilities in slice selection, network function repositories, interworking functions, exposure functions, so security edge protection, and last but not least, the service communication proxy, i.e. what people are calling the 5G service mesh. For the policy and charging portion of this decomposed control plane, where obviously we have policy control as well as the charging, and a newer function within 5G, the binding support, which is, again, part of cloud native, is this notion of keeping state separate from the entities so that you can actually go stateless, which helps things for load balancing and survivability. And so, not only has the architecture embraced it, but as part of the 5G SBA framework, but it's also meshes very well, no pun intended, with the underlying infrastructure of a cloud native PaaS. When necessary, in order to support the PCC, we also have some data management pieces explicitly, the user data repository and the unstructured data. And we're also taking advantage of, you'll see here, we are a leader in enterprise analytics, and we're taking that knowledge from machine learning and our data science capabilities and bringing that into the network DAF world. So some people also see us talk, you'll see us talk a lot about cloud native testing and those pieces. We're not a generic platform vendor. We do bring a cloud native environment to the table as a really illustrative capability. Some operators are using it for production. Other operators have used it as a benchmark to help them establish and learn what cloud native is about. And likewise, we have a testing framework that can either be consumed wholly to give themselves the base for a pipeline, but fundamentally it's there to help them understand how to unit test our particular network functions and ensure that the surrounding environment that our network functions go into is fit for the network functions to work properly. And so they're not necessarily meant to go head to head against those who specialize in pipelines, testing frameworks, or cloud native PaaS. We also have cloud, and people think of the classical 3 hyperscalers, but we're likewise a hyperscaler. We have 29 data centers, of which 6 interconnect into Azure, so you're one hop away. So when the carriers do start embracing the IaaS world of public cloud, which we're already seeing with the back office, but we believe it's also fit for front office. And at some point, that may start happening. We've already seen some announcements around how some hyperscaler public cloud infrastructure is being used to host smaller things like IoT slices. But we know that this is fit for these purposes because, for instance, those of you who I'm sure GoToMeeting will love me talking about this, but those who probably use Zoom in their everyday lives, you're actually using the media path is going on top of Oracle's cloud. So it's reliable enough for over the top to be using for communication purposes. And so I think that once you start bundling all these capabilities together, you really find that we're the kind of partner that a CSP can have that understands not only the depth of where communications came from with our legacy and signaling and session, but also we completely understand that hyperscaler world where cloud native came from and where a lot of the threats are coming from, and really can bring these two worlds together as a partner to help carriers embrace cloud native so that they can, again, mitigate that risk no matter which camp they're in, and be able to use this technology appropriately. And again, I want to emphasize appropriately, because cloud native for cloud native's sake is not the right answer. It needs to be something that you thoroughly understand the implications, and you're using it to really achieve those goals in those different quadrants. So with that, thank you, and I think we'll move to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Todd. So yeah, what I just want to pick up on is a little bit the poll results. I think they were kind of interesting. I've got actually a comment here from David, who's posted a comment on the Q&A, which is that perhaps the high proportion of respondents who have claimed that cloud native is a core part of their current network transformation are influenced by those who came or attracted to this webinar. But I just wanted to get your, oh, you've gone in the dark, Shackle, that's better. I want to turn to you, Shackle. Were you surprised by that scoring, and where would you put Telenor? And maybe just briefly introduce your role as well, because you've got a unique sort of perspective in that you're kind of got one foot in architecture and the other in deployment.
Yeah, hi, my name is Shakil Ahmed, as Phil introduced me. I work in Telenor Group as a platform global lead. We are working to ensure that the platform has the architecture that we define, and also we make sure that the deployment that we have in 9 countries doesn't have local deviation. So coming back to the poll results, I think this is also, in your finding in the reports, is how you categorize that there's 2 group of operators, and that kind of maybe reflected in the poll. I'm not surprised, and I see the points. We are probably in the ambitious group. We are looking forward to deploy cloud native 5G standalone architecture with Kubernetes. We are in some of the BUs, so we are getting ready to launch 5G SA.
Okay, thank you very much, Shakil. And Darwin, just want to bring you in on that. Where would you put SaskTel within those 4 categories? And were you surprised by the results?
So I'll introduce myself as Darwin Jans. I am a strategic technology planner for SaskTel, and my role is to look across our carrier network technologies in the industry and help provide guidance of where we need to go in the future, what's happening, what's important, and what we should do about it. And so when I look at this poll, I'm not really convinced, Matt. The selection of questions, it seems to be very binary. 1 yes and 3 categories of no. And even though SaskTel is a smaller service provider, as compared to the global community, I would vote yes on our side, because absolutely we are moving in the direction and adopting components of software and cloud native and moving along with the industry. But I also would suggest that we're emerging with it. So our answer is yes. We're stepping forward to grow and emerge. I did expect the majority of the votes to be on the yes for that reason. Organizations are going to start adopting these tools.
Okay, and thanks for that, Darwin. And I was a bit surprised, maybe because based on all the interviews that we had during the research, we got a sense that they were more in that second category. But I just wanted to check with you, Todd. Your experience, dialogue with operators globally, were you surprised by this scoring, or is that more or less in line with how you see things evolving?
No, it seems to be in line with what we're seeing. I think the devil is in the details as to what people consider, really what they're at, where they're at in their planning stage. But we see a lot of lab activity where people are getting their hands dirty with this technology.
Okay, great. So I've got another question for Shakil. What do you think, if you had to boil it down, to like the three key benefits that Telenor is expecting, what would they be from cloud native? If I had to sort of put you on the spot and you had to distill, what are the three top things that Telenor is expecting from cloud native in the network?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of benefits of cloud native, at least on paper, but maybe if I need to identify three, I would go for first one is the cloud economics. Like Todd mentioned in the presentation about the survivability of the service provider. So being efficient in delivering the services, and we have a experience in NFV deployment, and we are looking forward for cloud native architecture to be more efficient. So cloud economics, the first one, and that's probably the second one is the agility, faster deployment, time to market, which cloud native promises a lot. And in our trials and POC, we have seen that. And probably the last one is larger or more automation than NFV, what we have achieved so far. Like if you look at OpenStack scheduling versus Kubernetes scheduling, there is a lot of difference in, and those capabilities could be used for much larger automation, which, I mean, automation is very hyped word, but we are looking for automation that would give us real benefit, and that's where we see Kubernetes-based cloud native deployment will give us.
Great. No, thank you. That's pretty concise and very clear. And Darwin, this promise of the technology, do you see this as applicable, essential, and inevitable in terms of this promise for operators such as yourself?
It's kind of a loaded question, Phil, with the applicable, essential, and inevitable. Lots of factors there, and as well as stating the promise of. So it is very much applicable to the industry. It's very much applicable to SaskTel, even with our size and our scale. The industry is moving in this direction for good reason, and we are going to have to be well thought to align with that industry. Is it inevitable? I believe absolutely, because again, the industry is transitioning. We need to find a better way. We need to be more effective, deliver to our customers with a better return on investment, better agility, speed to market, all those great things. But now I'm going to stumble a little bit on this term of essential and maybe criticize that a little bit, is that cloud native is very much an enabler, and it's bringing about a new method of operating for the company. That's really great. But would I call it essential? Probably not, because what I find is that is essential is our organizations understanding and pursuing our business models and our future business and our future opportunities, delivering to meet our customer needs and creating value out of it. To me, that's a word that regards essential. The other part of cloud native is that it's going to be necessary, critical, that we bring more things together than just the sake of something being cloud native. We need to make sure we have the right cloud infrastructure, tools, and methods in place. Yes, we need good network solutions that are designed with intent to be cloud native, not just a pig with lipstick on it. We need to have the management platforms, the management and orchestration platforms surrounding that so we can operate with this stuff. And given that it's going to change our business processes and our people, so we have to transform our people, transform our processes, and gain organizational alignment. So those factors have to be wrapped together to allow us to move forward with cloud native and deliver to our future market needs. And those future market needs is what I'd consider as essential. And I guess you had made another comment of, kind of with respect to, can we pull this off? I think the industry needs to have a really good reflection here. And I like Todd's comments on, Oracle's commitment for interoperability. That fundamental element of interworking interoperability is going to be key for the success. And when I was listening to Todd, I started to reflect on other work that STL Partners had done on the collaboration era. I'd also like to suggest that some merit, some strength has to be applied to the industry with the solutions in their collaboration. We need vendors and solutions and partners that are committed to be well aligned to deliver this evolution and this transformation.
Okay, so that's fair enough in terms of, the industry needs to meet more. I wanted to just come back to you. Well, there's a question here, and I'm kind of bouncing straight to the questions, Todd, because I think there's some interesting questions. So Richard has asked a question around skills and staff. So the question here, and maybe I'll share it across all three of you, but it is the reason that some operators are more cautious due to lack of skills within sort of cloud native skill set. Do you think that is potentially the case, Todd, based on your conversations?
Yes. So I think that Darwin hit it right on the head. It's a transformation of many pieces, not just technology, but also of processes and people. And that's fundamental. And I know, Phil, you and I've talked about this a little bit in the research, but our view is that pretty much anyone who wants to embrace this successfully is going to have to be a software-oriented company. And when I say that, it's not that your technicians who used to go around typing CLI commands are going to have to be hardcore, object-oriented Java programmers. But it does mean that they have to understand software processes and methodologies, and probably move from that CLI world into one where everything is code. And I think that that's a fundamental mental shift for people to make at all levels, for executives to acknowledge that, and for the staff to gain the skills that's necessary. Because the more that you treat everything, the configuration, the network, the business as code that gets placed into the quote pipeline, the greater the benefit, the reduction of error. Just briefly, what really enlightened me on this came from not the comm space, but in a conference where I was talking to someone who, we were struggling with getting PCI compliance on our brand new SaaS billing service. And here was a fintech that had a CI/CD pipeline where they were delivering nightly builds, and he was doing it with PCI compliance. And I was baffled and asked him, how did you do that? And he said it's not just our application that's put on the pipeline. He says the pipeline, and this is really meta, the pipeline itself and all of the business processes are in the pipeline. And so that the compliance inspectors know that everything is version controlled, and the way they operate as a business itself is processed through that pipeline. And that the risk of them falling out of PCI compliance and by doing some business change is almost non-existent. And so when you back away and you start looking at how something as complicated as maintaining one of the highest strict standards to compliance can actually be done by treating the business as code. It becomes a really, really powerful paradigm. And so yes, the skills are going to have to shift, and people are going to have to be more software oriented to really get the maximum out of this.
So, Shaka, can I pick up on that? In terms of your experience in sort of beginning to roll out and implement this across multiple geographies and slight differences of those environments, has this been the main barrier for you with skills, or are there other barriers that you've encountered in driving that adoption and getting the teams to embrace it?
So you mean the cloud native part, or?
Yeah, the cloud native in particular. Those practices, and just that shift in operating model, in mindset, and how the teams work. What's been the key challenges you've seen?
Yeah, I think for cloud native part, the main obstacle that we see is that it's a similar challenge in the NFV. We had the same challenge in NFV. So that was, I think, in NFV space, the experience we gained was really crucial. This was a journey for us, and we learned a lot in the virtualization NFV journey. And we saw that in NFV, of course, there was a lot of talk about whether OpenStack is ready for prime time or not. But the main challenge actually came from the VNF vendors' VNF, and we see the same challenge is actually happening in CNF for cloud native architecture. So in some CNF vendor, you'll see that they will want to bring their full stack. So meaning the Linux operating system, Kubernetes, the SDN, the rack and stack, basically everything they want to bring with their CNF. This is, I think, number one obstacle. Like you need to find your partner wisely. And then the second probably one we saw that even if you want to have a common, let's say, cloud native architecture, you will hit. The second thing is the CNI trap for CNF. Again, this is connected to CNF, but this is a little bit going into the detail of the design. CNI is the container networking interface, and that's where I think CNCF also identified this is a bottleneck. And I think maybe for 5G SA deployment, one of the like the last maybe the challenge, because I will limit myself to 3, is the how you want to deploy service-based architecture. Okay. Whether you want to use ESTO service mesh, or you want to go for 3GPP release 16 SCP-based architecture. And okay. Yeah, we have our preference, but yeah, probably this you need to answer.
Some big decisions then in terms of that, and then in terms of the network functions themselves, and what come with them, or how easy it is to insert them into the stack you decide. And I guess from their point of view, the vendor's point of view, they've developed on an environment, and you want to get some guarantees that they will work on your environment, and that's always going to be a challenge if it's different. And I think that challenge is being repeated at the moment with the RAN, and with the eventual evolution to Open RAN. I think we're seeing some of that there too. So I'd like to encourage the audience to provide some questions. We are seeing some more questions coming in here. But before I go on to those, I'm going to ask one more question of my own to you, Matt. I mean, Matt, we talked about the risk of complacency, and you talked about the consequences for operators that were slow to react to that. What do you think the actual consequences are for an operator that was perhaps unable to, unwilling to, or for whatever reason was not moving fast enough? What are the real consequences here? Oh, you're on mute, Matt. Sorry, can't hear you.
Yeah, that always helps to not be on mute. Yeah, as we highlighted in the presentation, I think there definitely are some operators who are kind of at risk of complacency, but I think who this applies to really, it does just come down to the market environment as was described. And I think each operator maybe needs to take a look at their market environment and decide for themselves. And I think this was the key terminology that we took into designing the 2x2 matrix. And it's about their perceived market environment, so the perceived amount of pressure that the operators are feeling. And there may be many operators who ultimately look at their market and think that, you know what, the competition here, they're not going to adopt full cloud native practices either. So it's something that we don't need to worry about. But I think for many operators, they can look at their market and in fact their competition will be adopting full cloud native practices. And the consequences of this are, you know, your competition will be reaping the benefits that you are not. So if your competition are being more innovative and perhaps delivering new services and applications that you might not be able to, then this obviously puts you at a disadvantage. And even if you become a late mover, you still don't want to be playing catch up. And I think this is, you know, this is why we had the specific wording when we came to the matrix, was that for all operators, regardless of the reality of their market, it's better to move, and it's better to the phrasing that we had, you know, urgently reevaluate your situation. You don't want your competition to be innovating in a way that you're not able to and delivering new services and applications that you can't, because this will ultimately end up hitting your bottom line. And I think, yeah, these are the kind of consequences that we were alluding to.
Okay, thanks for that. Just hoping to get a few more questions from the audience. Please do submit them. There's some questions here a little bit about hyperscalers. Just wondering, I'm just going to ask a quick question to you, Todd. I mean, we've heard a little bit from Shakil, some of the challenges that he's seen. If you had to sort of distill it to what are the big pitfalls to look out for an operator. I mean, Shakil did set out these particular issues around what he's seeing. What have you seen as being the big pitfalls to look out for when moving forward with cloud native deployments in networks?
So far, really, the largest has been the ability to embrace the changes. And so I think a lot of organizations have just solidified themselves around, you know, 1 or 2 releases a year. The whole every network still has the Christmas blackout where you know there's no changes, and so everyone's rushing to get, you know, releases and a change to the network before then. And the established, I'm not saying that there isn't a role for, you know, friendly trials and verification offices and those kinds of things. But I will say that once you've adopted the process of having more frequent releases, so from the actual production of the network functions all the way out to deploying and operating them, and you start tuning yourself to that incremental content and the benefits that it can bring from that risk mitigation that I was talking about, it sort of becomes very difficult to back yourself away from that. And so I think some folks are going to find it difficult to, if this is really where the ecosystem is going, to still maintain, well, actually, I only want to do 2 or 3 releases a year. Because really what that's doing is it forces the community to accumulate a large number of changes, and then really you're going to get back into, well, then now we need to do this massive regression and this massive soak. And so, you know, really where I want to go with this is it's not something that can be sort of hybridized or watered down. I'm not necessarily, you have to say you have to slam forward and change your network nightly, you know, like a Netflix or someone does in their world. But I do think that you can't say, well, I'm going to be cloud native, but I'm only going to, you know, do this stuff, you know, once or twice a year. And I think that people who think they can do that are really going to sap the benefits and value away from this and potentially harm themselves and harm the ecosystem, because it's going to make the ecosystem more expensive to support that.
Okay, so that's things to look out for. I think we've got just enough time maybe to ask another question. So Lakshmi's asked a couple of questions, and I wanted to pick out the second question, which is, I know it's kind of topical and it always comes up, which is, what is the role do you see for hyperscalers? And I guess we could almost include Oracle in that, because you set out, Todd, that you're pretty much the fourth or fifth hyperscaler, even if it's not commonly set out that way. And you know, will they play a greater role? And I think there's always a lot on challenges and opportunities, but let's focus on the role. So will they play a greater role in cloud native networks? What do you think that's possible, likely, just open to it? Darwin, have you got a view on this?
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot to that question, as well as, do hyperscalers have a role? I would say certainly. Hyperscalers are pursuing business models and opportunities by pushing their applications to become more capable down to the edge, which service providers are first or front and center in generating the infrastructure that provides that edge. So what's questionable in my mind is, as those applications enrichen and become adopted by consumers, customers, what's the extent of service providers' role? You know, are we essentially establishing the edge cloud environment for the hyperscalers to create value for our customers? You know, and aligned with STL, it points to us to put more thought and effort into how we move up the food chain in that ecosystem for us to provide value to maintain relevance. I think that's really important. I guess another aspect of these. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Phil.
No, go ahead. You had more.
Well, someone had asked a question here. I think it was Richard with respect to the hyperscalers, and he asked about would telcos be acquired by them as they partner with us. And I certainly see that there is a risk of hyperscalers, but also with you know, the large scale operators, you know, that consolidation can occur. And as we move toward cloud native solutions and the flexibility of those solutions being able to be delivered on any cloud, we're going to see that grow. I've been watching this probably since about 2014, and I started asking our vendors if they have, asked all of our vendors if they have the vision, you know, now with NFV, do you believe that you can deploy and deliver network functions that are greenfield so that operators can subscribe and buy the use of them, so that then we focus on the configuring and delivering of the service to our customer? And every one of them replied with, yes, that is on our roadmap. But since 2014 till now, I've really not seen that surface until recently, with the emergence of Microsoft, with the acquisition of Metaswitch and Affirm Networks, and a little bit out of Rakuten stating that they've designed their mobile solution to be sold as a service. So maybe we're at a point where the door is being opened a little greater.
Okay, and
for that shift.
So that's more than just infrastructure then. Certainly there's a role, and potentially a role beyond just providing infrastructure and cloud infrastructure. Shaka, we've only got a minute or so left, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you see potentially a greater role for hyperscalers and those companies within the network?
Yeah, I think especially in the enterprise market, if you look at, you know, the enterprise are already using public cloud extensively. So their applications are already in public cloud. So if there is a use case that they need, you know, like more bandwidth or lesser latency, like we see with the emerging of private networks. I think, like there is a scope for both for operators and the public cloud providers to get into that business
That's what we'll
model.
see. That's what we'll see it as. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank everyone here on the panel and thank the audience for joining and participating in the poll, and thank Oracle who sponsored this event. As we say, we will be sharing the slides, we'll be sharing the questions and our responses. Please do go and download the report, and we'll send you the link to that. And I wish you all a very good afternoon or a good morning. And thanks for joining us today.